Welcome to Age of AI, Politics, Law, and Society, hosted by Medlir Chris Lamont, and Young Diogenes, in association with the Global Governance Institute in Brussels.
Hi, I'm your host, Medlir and I have the pleasure of welcoming back to our program Dr. Gloria Shkurti Ozdemir, the author of the recently released book, Artificial Intelligence Arms Dynamics, The Case of the U.S. and China Rivalry. A researcher in the Foreign Policy Directorate at the SIDA Foundation in Turkey, Gloria also serves as the assistant editor of Inside Turkey, a journal published by the SIDA Foundation. Gloria, welcome to Age of AI.
Thank you very much, Medlir. It's a pleasure for me to be here again with you.
It's great to have you back. I was just looking back in my notes and the first episode that we recorded with you, and I think we last had you in our program back in January of 2022, which feels like an eternity ago. I mean, with everything, right? I mean, it's not that long, and yet 2.5 years ago, and yet it seems like so much has happened. So I look forward to this conversation and catching up. But at the time, back in January of 2022, we actually discussed Turkey's ambitious plans for the development of AI technologies across various spaces, right? Not just the military technology, which is our today's topic. But I think a 5-year project that the country had at the time had just announced. Since then, Turkey's centrality in the AI race, not just in the military domain, but across various areas, has actually increased. Can you give us an update on where things stand on that front?
Indeed, it's quite interesting because at the time it was just a couple of months previous to our interview that Turkey had published its national strategy, AI national strategy. It was 2021, 2025. And just a couple of months ago, 2 or 3 months ago, they updated that strategy and they released a new action plan about the strategy. And indeed, it was updated based on another plan here in Turkey, which is published every 4 years, which is called as the development plan. And it was the 12th development plan for the period between 2024-2028. And in this development plan, it was emphasized in couple of places that Turkey needs to focus on artificial intelligence. And as a result, how can I say, reorganize even some of the institutions or policies, change some of the policies about this. And soon after the development plan, we have the update of the AI national strategy, which came focused more on the changing of the governance mechanism. They were focused on how Turkey can attract talents. So they provided some actions on this. And they decided that an expert committee will be established and will be focused especially on the technical and ethical standards for the domestic developed generative AI models. Because, by the way, this action plan was trying to keep up with the technological development.
Right.
Maybe that's why it seems quite a long time that we've not talked with each other, because the technology has changed so much in this period. So it's developing every day. So in this action plan, they try to catch up with what's new. And we have the creation of this ethics committee. There were discussions about reforms in education on how they should support students and also universities trying to focus more on AI. Another important topic that was in this action plan was about the work transformation. One of the most discussed topic about AI is how it will affect unemployment. So in Turkey, they are trying to take steps about this and see how they can move, how can they minimize the impact of AI in this area. And also they talked about increasements of investments on AI. And soon after this action plan was published, just a couple of weeks later, Turkey announced a new program, which was called as HIT 30, meaning that the government was going to focus and invest $30 billion on the high-tech technology, including here AI, which I tried to put this step by step, like the development plan, the action plan, and the investments, because these three are highly connected with each other. And the HIT 30 project was a very big issue here in Turkey, a very important topic, because it's the first time that such a high investment is done in terms of research and development. and in terms of technology in here. And is expected to have a great impact, to tell the truth, even not just on AI, for example, but they have been investing on semiconductors, because taking into consideration what's going on back and forth between China and the US in terms of semiconductors. So they are trying to focus on creating their own technology, their own fabs here. And these were just in general. By the way, I forgot to mention the fact that Turkey has been focusing too much on the generative AI, especially in terms of large language models. Because like in many occasions, here the perspective is that, for example, ChatGPT or Llama or the other project or the other models, like they do somehow represent a perspective of the people, or at least the culture that's behind those that created the model, and does not truly provide Turkish perspective, at least. So they have been working too much on these issues, and they are about to announce their own generative model, which is called T3I, which means AI with AI, but at the same time, like T3 family. Other companies as well are working on this, but this is seen as a project which will also impact the Turkish role in the region because it's in Turkish.
Gloria, is this initiative top-down? Meaning, is the government on this development, this latest model you're talking about, is the government running this program, or is this a private?
No, this is a private industry. But I need to mention the fact that the T3 Foundation, it is also associated with the foundation of Bayraktar.
That was my follow-up question. So in the Bayraktar case, there is a very close relationship between the private companies and government officials or the government itself, and there's very close collaboration there. And of course, that happens in the United States as well.
Is it still
the picture? Is it still the same situation?
The collaboration in the terms of the drones, because it is mostly a national security issue that brings both like the company and the government even closer. But because this is a soft tool, like most probably like the government does support this kind of initiative, but the foundation, the finance and the funding and also the organization, the creation of the model is coming from the company itself. Like until now, we do not see the government and the company coming too much together, as we saw it in the case of the drone.
You mentioned the Bayraktar drones, and we discussed this in the last episode together, and I'm sure that for our listeners, they can go back and listen to that episode as well. But one of the things that's happened since we last spoke is an increased volatility in the region, and I mean Turkish near abroad. Of course, we have the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Right before that, if I'm not mistaken, we had the Azerbaijan-Armenia conflict, where, again, Turkish Bayraktar drones played an important role. We have seen the use of both PSYOPs, but also cyber attacks and other kinds of semi-automated weapon systems in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And then, of course, over the last year, after the October 7th attacks against Israel, we have seen an increase in volatility in Turkey's immediate near abroad, right? As Turkish officials and Turkish society kind of like looks around and reflects on this really volatile situation, and especially in the context, I mean, we mentioned all these examples in the Azerbaijan-Armenia conflict and Russia-Ukraine, the use of AI-enabled tools and technologies, but especially even more so in the case of Israel with the use of the Iron Dome, electronic fence protections, right, the drones and spyware, Pegasus and others, where AI has been very central, arguably, in both the calculations and miscalculations regarding the conflict. What lessons are Turkish officials drawing from what they're seeing? Any changes in conversations among government officials? Any interesting developments in that front that points to a reflection of the changing security environment?
Yeah, so I will take this from the general to more specific on AI. Okay, so when it comes to the conflict, especially that we are facing right now, for example, on Israel, Turkey has been quite attentive on what's going on and all of the technologies that they are using. I have to say that it is not too much discussed in here because these are some topics that they are secretive most of the time.
I was going to say, are they not discussed or they're just not discussed openly?
I think they are not discussed openly because just yesterday, for example, on October 8th, there was a meeting here in Turkey between the members of the parliament, which was done behind closed doors, and the discussions that were taking place in there yesterday, like they are prohibited to be discussed for the next 10 years, like outside of those doors. So all the decisions and all the discussions that have been taking, that will be taken in there. So taking into consideration that I've been here in Turkey for 12 years now, to 13 maybe, and I've never heard of a meeting like this taking place before. And thinking about the fact that Turkey has been facing a lot of threats for most of the time in its borders. So it's the first time that I've seen something like this, and it's quite important, I think. And I believe that in that meeting, they have taken into consideration all of these developments, especially in terms of the military and technological developments. AI has emerged as a primary topic, especially in this conflict. But even prior to that, Turkey has been very focused on the AI area. We talked about Bayraktar drones like TB2s and so on, Anka and so on. So right now, in the last years, especially with the AI and the technology modernizing, we see Turkey and the companies that are creating these drones trying to upgrade this technology. So very soon we will have an upgraded version of TB2, which is called like TB3. And it has the possibility, it is an aircraft carrier tailored drone, not just from the land, but from the aircraft carrier, which it is an indigenous product, by the way. And we have Anka 3 that's we expect to come quite soon as well, and another drone. We have also a Khan fighter jet, which is fifth generation fighter jet. But at the same time, there were done some announcements that Turkey has started working on the sixth generation fighter jet, which means that that will include integration with artificial intelligence. Nothing clear yet about that, but the fact that they are still working on, they are planning something like this brings to the fore the importance of AI in Turkish national strategy. Another important development, I should not forget this, it is a decision that was taken from the National Security Council, if I'm not wrong, in July of this year. National Security Council here in Turkey, it is one of the most important councils that take decision in terms of security and national strategy. So everything is deciding during these meetings, and they meet in certain periods of time and formulate the national strategy. And in one of those meetings, in July, it was stated clearly artificial intelligence will be a national priority. And it was highlighted that the importance and that Turkey needs to be prepared, not only just for the scientific and economic side, but as well for the military side of artificial intelligence, and should be focused on developing it. So this was a quite step for Turkey here, because not something like that didn't happen, taking in consideration that the national strategy was published in 2021 when we talked. Right. So maybe, I'm just supposing it here, what's going on with Israel right now and what they are showing in there, this may be also a response of that and what Turkey needs to do,
Well, I guess the conflict's not the only thing that's been happening, and also in terms of your own personal life. We just mentioned that you have published a book, and I'll get to that in just 1 second. But before that, I was very curious to hear your views on your recent visit to Washington, D.C. I know you have met with academics, industry leaders, and government officials, and of course, without revealing anything confidential, I just wanted to get a sense from you, right, coming from this very volatile situation and understanding what's going on in Turkey itself. How do you perceive, how would you compare in a way your impressions in the regions with what you found in the United States?
During the period here in Turkey, it's generally when you talk about AI, the discussions remain somehow superficial. And because even despite the facts that we've been talking on what Turkey is doing in terms of defense or on the other areas and the strategies and so on, when it comes to the people in here and the discussion, they somehow remain on some superficial levels. The unemployment, what is going to affect us? Is it a bad thing? It's a good thing, or so on. But when I went to the US, it was a totally different perspective. And it's quite understandable to tell the truth, because we are talking about a superpower in here that's been focusing on AI for decades and that are in a great competition right now. So I was very, not surprised, but strange feeling, to tell the truth, to find out that the discussions in there were mainly on the private tech companies, like their impact on the AI development. And because it was also this period of elections in there, so like the stances of both candidates on AI, supporting regulations or not supporting regulations, and the military aspect in here and so on. So these were some of the most important topics discussed in there. And it somehow brings to us a new reality on the changes on the international system that we are having, because it's bringing new actors, something like this, like something that we didn't think about before. And we have to change how we see the international system now. But at the same time, something, to tell the truth, that it was generally discussed, even openly, or even in the meetings that I had, it was about the funds, the funding, and that the US indeed is remaining a little bit behind in terms of the funding on AI especially, or even semiconductors issue and so on. So this was an issue of great concern for the US, or at least for the people that I met there. And so yes, we have two different perspectives. Like in there, we have the threat of China and how the US needs to fund more and to do more to not allow these rivals to pass them, to overpass them. But in Turkey, we have a more like subtle in the future AI, what is going to be, and at some point, how we can use it in the military aspect. So they like the national interest of both states interfering also on the general discourses. Yeah.
Well, let's stay a little bit on this. This is also, by the way, the subject of your book, which I imagine was part of the reason you were having those conversations over there. First of all, congratulations on a very well researched and written book. I really enjoyed reading it and learned a lot from it.
Thank you.
The first question that came to mind before the substance was access to documents. So your book is about the U.S.-China AI arms rivalry. And I can imagine that it's not very easy to find, not just in the United States, but also especially in China, given the language barriers and also the more secretive nature of the Chinese government. So tell us a little bit about this process on data and research. How difficult was it? How did you navigate it? And did you use any AI tools to help with the research part of it?
Yeah, this was one of the most difficult parts, because as you stated, when it comes to military, it's quite secretive. And when it comes to China, it's even more.
Right.
And it's not also, by the way, the secretive side. It's also the fact of the data that does not always fit. For example, when I was trying to find data about the US and the government investments and so on, and I was trying to compare them with the other sides, somehow they were similar, or at least, somehow they were similar or close with each other. But when it comes to China, it was a totally different idea. I could get different information about the funding from the Chinese government. I could take different information from CIPRI, for example, and they do not fit. And what the US is saying about China, the US government is saying about China, it was totally different. So it was very difficult to bring this together and somehow to make the analysis. Because like for investments on research and development, investments on AI, it's one of the main focuses of this book, to tell the truth. So this was one of the main problems. The second problem was about the military aspect, that China is quite secretive in there. And like US, of course, is secretive, but still somehow they give you something where you can take something from there, or you can analyze at least. But with China, it was quite difficult. But it was good that some of the institutions in the US did provide the translation of most of the documents, most of the official documents about China. And that helped me quite a lot, to tell the truth. And of course, as you said, AI tools. I'm very glad that I wrote my pieces during the book, during this period, because it's quite, if I did something like this a couple of years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, it would have been very
So what did you use? What did you use primarily?
So I used ChatGPT, and it was DeepL, another program used as DeepL, and I used both of them in trying to translate the news and the articles, because in the chapter on China, I used some articles from the most well-known Chinese academicians on how they see the AI and the revolution, military revolutions, and so on. So I translated their articles with this, and I compared, for example, what ChatGPT was saying and DeepL was saying, and trying to get something from there, And in general, they were correct. And also, sometimes I did the fact that, for example, I took the official documents, I translated them with ChatGPT, for example, and then I read also the American sources, and it was quite similar, not too much of a difference, or at least in context.
Let's turn our attention to your book a little bit more in terms of the content of that. Would you characterize the U.S.-China competition in the area of AI as an arms race? We're taking that for granted. And I imagine there are people that may want to pull back from that conversation because it just conjures up Cold War types of rhetoric. But so would you characterize it as an AI arms race? And if so, what are the key factors that are driving that race?
One of the main issues that I touched upon, this is like, in the book, I was focused mostly through a theoretical perspective with Busan's frameworks and so on. So in here, Busan points out that when you state like arms race, it does have in itself a negative connotation, meaning that there will be a war very soon. It is an abnormal situation when we talk about an arms race, right? And Busan mentions the fact that when there is these military revolutions, especially technological military revolutions, sometimes the states themselves need to upgrade their militaries. They are obliged to, because there is this technological imperative that forces them to do so. So they have either to upgrade their militaries, the technological militaries, and maintain their power, for example, or they don't do that and they lose their power in the international system. So when they do so, sometimes like this should not be considered as an arms race. If US is now upgrading its military, it's not because like it feels itself like we will go in a war with China, at least like a couple of years ago, let's say. But it is because like they have to. It's not a luxury; it's an obligation for them to do so. So when a state does this, the other states, it's important how they respond to this. Like they see this as a threat, or they just upgrade their military just because of this technological imperative. So if they are upgrading their technologies to keep up, at least with the technological developments, then this is not an arms race, he mentions. So this is just a military build-up. But if they are doing this because they think that there is a war, there will be a war very soon, then it means that there is an arms race. But somewhere in between, these states do upgrade their military, but they, at the same time, they respond to the actions of the other states, because we should not forget that we live in an international, we are in an international system. So at this point, it's not an arms race, but it is a competition, meaning that there is no war, at least seen in the short term, between these powers. For example, according to Busan, like the US, Soviet Union, Cold War, it is not an arms race. When you say it's an arms race, it's a wrong usage of the term, but it is an arms competition because they never fought with each other directly. It came very close in many situations, but it never was a direct war between these two. So this is the main difference.
How would you respond? I like both the historical parallels and the distinction, but of course the pushback would be that, especially during the Cold War, a lot of this competition was clearly in response to one another rather than just this technological imperative that you're talking about.
Yeah.
You have...
That's why that's not an arms build-up, but it is a competition, because when it's...
But is it just a semantic difference and the outcome still being the same, that is increased tensions between the countries?
When it is an arms race, it means that there is a war. There will be a direct clash between both of them. For example, let's suppose a clash between US and China over Taiwan. Then that would be an arms race. But the fact that they are just trying to keep up with the technological imperative and at the same time somehow keep an eye open for the enemy, then this brings them just at the competition level. There are a lot of elements that I analyzed in the book, like a lot of factors and 3 different models that Busan proposes in here. For example, like we can see the funding, the investments of US and China, just as an example to tell you, like research and development. Sorry, in the military, let's start first. So we see the budget of the US investment on the military, it's somehow like raising, But when we see it as a share of the GDP per capita, as a share of GDP, then it doesn't change. It stays the same. And this shows that indeed, in terms of when there will be a war especially between great powers, there is a tendency of the military investments as a share of the GDP, increasing a lot. But it's not the same with the US, and it's the same also for China. They remain quite stable in that sense. When we come, for example, in the investments for research and development, in the case of the US, they have been remaining stable in terms of the share of the GDP. But in the case of China, we don't see that. China has been increasing its investments on research and development, not just when we see it in general, but also as a share of GDP, which shows us that China in here is somehow threatening the US interest. And that's why this brings a little bit problems for the arms competition, it moves closer to the arms race. And then we have the investments on AI, which the US has been increasing quite a lot, even as a share of GDP. And on the case of China, they have been increasing as well, which brings us closer to the thinking of the idea that maybe there may be an arms race. Right. However, there are other elements. For example, the fact that to apply an AI model within the military, it takes 10 years for both the US and China right now, meaning that it is a very long procedure on there going on, and it's difficult for both of the states to feel themselves 100% safe and move directly into a war between each other, because they don't know and they don't have full capabilities at their hands right now. Okay, they have something, but not fully applicable, and even both of the militaries in the US and China, because I focused also on the organization structure and so on, they are quite reluctant to apply these new technologies. And this brings us closer to the fact somehow, there will be a military built up, not an arms race, And there are a lot of other elements that I don't think we have the time to go all of this.
But I really appreciate you actually raising it, because one of the questions that I had that I think you addressed is how AI advancements, both in China and the United States, are influencing their military strategies, and especially national security policy. So I really appreciate you flagging that. When we think about international regulatory efforts, there's been a lot of conversation, a lot of discussions on this. What role do you think international regulatory efforts can play in managing the risks of a possible AI arms race, right? So we'll use your kind of nomenclature there in sense of that we're not there yet. I think that's the verdict.
So we would say AI arms competition.
Right. So we're not yet in the arms race. There is the risk of it.
There is the possibility.
You're indicating that perhaps China's kind of share GDP indicates maybe an elevated kind of risk of that. But any role for regulatory efforts, international regulatory efforts? Have you seen anything in those conversations where either countries are paying kind of attention to what's going on internationally? There are a lot of conversations both in Geneva and New York, right? There's a lot of AI rules and compacts that have been not just strictly in the military sector, but just generally
in general,
that aim at de-escalation, right? That aim at other use of AI rather than just the military one, but also constrain how states use them.
The most important topic is about the nuclear. That's our red flag. And that's one of the most discussed topics as well. And there are a lot of discussions, but nothing on the table.
So when you say nuclear, you're meaning the use of AI?
Use of AI with nuclear weapons. Yeah.
Okay.
So in decision-making, for example, that would be a red flag. Imagine leaving the decision. And for example, there were a lot of studies done with the LLMs models. They realized that these models, the AI models, were quite they were put on these war games, and the LLM models were quite leaned towards escalation of war rather than de-escalation, It's the human factor indeed that impacts the de-escalation in there. So imagine this being applied in nuclear weapons.
Well, as you also going back to your visit to DC, I know that 2 or 3 years ago, there was the idea that we would never, ever embed AI in nuclear weapons in decision-making, right? Whether you launch or you don't launch. But since then, there has been a little bit of a shift in that. We're saying, well, of course, there will always be a human that will press the button, but we already are. And again, you can see this also with the Iron Dome right now with Israel. that the calculations in terms of target trajectory, right, risk analysis, and likelihood of damage.
It's necessary to be done to be used.
Exactly. Then you use AI for that. And then this gets to what you're pointing at is AI seems to always be erring on the side of escalation rather than de-escalation. Have you seen any shift in the rhetoric, both in China and the United States, with regard to the competitiveness of AI in these systems?
Yeah, that is what I was I wanted to emphasize here. I've seen discussions from both the Chinese and the US side that, especially when it comes to the nuclear aspect, they are willing to sit together and to discuss for possible regulations on this. The Chinese side has been open, and the Biden administration has been open as well. There have been at the beginning of this year, after the meeting of Xi and Biden, they were decided that several meetings will follow up and will decide on somehow possible AI regulations. And while it was not clearly stated, but all of the experts in the US, they were discussing about most probably they will focus on the nuclear. And the Chinese side has, as I stated, it's quite open on this area that they want to discuss on possible uses of AI and nuclear. I'm not pretty sure if something will be achieved in there. I am a little bit pessimistic when it comes to regulations, especially about the AI, because it's quite new. It's a novel technology. We don't know anything about it. And we don't know how much are the states willing to give up now and agreeing to this kind of regulations is something that needs to be done, but I am not pretty sure if the states are willing to do so yet.
Well, maybe as we come to the end today, going back kind of full circle, was our conversation, the second half of this discussion here has been about the U.S.-China rivalry. So it's a basic global power dynamics and the impact that AI may have in this competition or race or rivalry in the coming decades. What do you think is the greatest impact of these AI technologies in terms of re-scrambling power relations, not just among great powers, but also middle powers, like Turkey, for example? We mentioned nuclear weapons, and nuclear weapons they're very particular in a way in terms of the power and the prestige they confer upon certain countries. But AI is not quite that technology and seems to be more accessible than nuclear weapons. So how do you think, looking to the future, AI may scramble this power dynamic around the world?
When I talk about the AI, I'm very scared of the impact that it may have on military especially. But when I think about its impact on international order, it makes me enthusiastic about this because it may be bad, but it brings the possibilities for change. We have always talked about this pyramid that we have the producers, the military producers, which the technological producers who are the superpowers, because the advantage on the technology and the advantage in military bring you also the power in the international system. And then on the second rank, we have these middle powers, let's say, they are part producers, but mostly dependent on the leaders, on the fully producer states. And also we have the third rank, which are all those states that don't have any capability to produce any military owned technology.
It just feels like a very feudal separation of labor, right?
Unfortunately, but this is kind of truth of the system that we are living, or at least this is how I see it. Yeah. I may be wrong. When we had this kind of technological developments previously, for example, for the nuclear weapons, it was very difficult to move between these separations, between these three separations. So superpowers, they had the money, they had the power to do so and to take control, or at least even the great powers to take control on this technology and to maintain their hierarchical position. However, AI, it's not like that. AI is bringing possibilities, especially to the second rank states, to the middle powers, to take advantage and being not fully dependent on these producer states, on these superpowers, but somehow it's allowing them to have a say in the international system and make possible, and maybe go from this three separation pyramid to a more different pyramid or what's between them. I see this AI changing the international order into a technopole order. I say, I really like this. And also AI I also use the concept of personalization of technology, because the way how it's used is allowing these states, especially like the middle powers, to focus on somewhere where they are successful. And for example, Turkey with the drones, it's allowing them the capability to focus on somewhere, to become an expert on that, and then have a say in the global affairs, something that was not possible before. And also something important I see, like the fact that when we try to understand, like we had the bipolar war for worlds before, with the US and Soviet Union in one hand, and the other states, they were somehow obliged to choose between these two powers, and most of them aligning with the US. It was the middle powers that were dependent on the states, on the great powers. But right now, like we have US and China, and these third middle powers, middle powers, they are not obliged anymore, or they do not feel at least pressured too much to choose between the US and China. Like we see a lot of states trying to keep a balance, and Turkey is one of them, like trying to keep a balance between both of these powers. We cooperate with the US, but we do also with China. And it is because of these technological developments that has allowed these middle power states to have more power and more say in the foreign politics and international affairs.
Gloria, thank you. That was very eye-opening, and I really appreciate it. Thank you for taking some time here from your busy schedule to be with us today.
Thank you very much for having me here.
And of course, for our listeners, that's it for today's show. Join us again next time for another discussion at the intersection of law, society, and politics. Until then, stay human.